Ram Kaluahin enjoyed the way the wind blew through his thick black hair as he drove his small American convertible along the two-lane highway that would take him and his wife to the southernmost part of his home island, Kaatani. Located in the South Pacific Ocean, Kaatani actually consisted of several islands, the largest of which stretched approximately 100 kilometers from tip to tip and was home to approximately 1.5 million local residents and another 100,000 foreigners, mostly Americans. Kaatani was an independent state with its own government, police, and defense forces. Historically, the country was ruled by a monarch but has adopted a democratic system similar to that of the United States. It had a president who was elected for one 5-year term and a House of Representatives, whose members were elected by the citizens every 2 years. The nation began an aggressive modernization campaign more than 70 years ago under a previous monarch who felt it was time to usher the population into the 20th century. As a result, Kaatani today had all the conveniences of modern life, including the internet, along with all the trappings of modern civilization. Fortunately, the people managed to stay true to most of their ancient values, and as a result, the country still had the lowest divorce rate in the world, even higher than India, which has a divorce rate of just 1% according to some reports. Apart from the strange rocks scattered along the slopes of Mount Satani that glowed at night, sandy beaches, and the hospitality of the population, Kaatani had little to offer would-be conquerors, and had so far escaped the stigma of foreign rule. Even the Japanese did not consider Kaatani during World War II, believing it to be too far south to be useful for conquest of the Pacific. This was the place where Ram was born and raised, the place he called home, and he loved it. It's a good day for a walk, he thought. Not too hot, not too cold, and the humidity was tolerable at this altitude. However, the reason for the trip made him both angry and sad. He looked at the woman sitting in the passenger seat. Her name was Marion. She was a California beauty, he thought. Blonde hair, soft, supple skin, firm breasts, and tanned, toned legs, made for sex. She was not just his wife, she was every man's cherished dream. He had a little over an hour before they reached their destination, so he remembered their life together. He met her 6 years ago when he first took a teaching job at the local campus of an American university headquartered in Washington, D.C. At that time, he had just defended his doctoral dissertation and decided to return home. The board of the local university welcomed him with open arms and offered him the position. He got used to it like a duck to water. He loved teaching and enjoyed teaching local youth. She worked as a consultant in the admissions office, and they met at a social reception hosted by the university president. They liked each other, dated for about a year, and eventually got married. She was an only child who had lost her parents in a car accident just a couple of years earlier. As far as he knew, she had no other relatives. Ironically, she wanted a traditional Kaatani marriage. He found this strange because most local girls these days wanted anything but a traditional marriage. At first he thought that perhaps she was either patronizing him or a little delusional, and questioned her about it. Perhaps she didn't fully understand the true meaning of what she said she wanted, he thought. But she was adamant that this was what she wanted. So he gave her a text file with a chant to repeat at the ceremony and taught her how to pronounce the words correctly. She already knew a little of the local language, enough to communicate in the local markets, but not enough to fully understand the true meaning of what she was about to dedicate herself to. The ceremony itself was wonderful. Towards the end, Marion, in her short white robe, knelt down and picked up the pillow that lay next to her. She handed it to him and chanted the traditional phrase perfectly. An approximate translation of this phrase into English was, "I submit to you, my husband, in body, mind, and spirit." Of course, this phrase had a much fuller meaning, but it has long since been largely forgotten by all but the oldest and most traditional part of the population. He grabbed the sivage lying on the pillow, a short curved dagger that in the old days husbands carried, a sign that they were forbidden and were ready to defend to the death what belonged to them, and only them. He admired Marian's work, an ornate pen bearing his family's seal. She even anointed him with her own blood, as was done in the old days. After he repeated the spell, he took a knife and cut the ties holding her robe in place, allowing it to fall to the ground. She remained motionless, and now her naked body was completely visible to those present. He opened his own robe and showed her his manhood. He then picked her up and laid her naked on the wedding altar. He spread her legs wide so everyone could see. He smiled as he looked at her. He moved closer and, in front of everyone present, got married on the altar. In ancient times, this was where the bride had to prove to her family and society at large that she was a virgin, worthy of her new husband. He helped her off the altar, and they walked down the hallway to his car. Now she belonged to him, and only him. After their first night on the island, they flew back to the States for a week-long honeymoon in Las Vegas. The next 3 years were wonderful. Ram and Marion continued their work at the university and spent their free time making tender love to each other. He could not imagine that life could become even a little better than it is now. Marion was then transferred to the main campus in Washington, D.C., so he too applied to transfer, hoping the school would give him a chance to teach at the U.S. Capitol. The board agreed to transfer him, and the two went to live and work in Washington. Marion lived there before coming to Cayetani and promised to show him all the sights, not knowing that he had spent several years in the city when he was in college. Over the next year and a half, a number of changes occurred in their lives. Marion's new position required her to sometimes work later than usual, travel, and attend social events where she rubbed shoulders with the rich and famous. Sometimes she took him with her to these events. Even though she had introduced him as her husband and professor, he had the feeling that he was a souvenir, or, worse, an exhibit, a zoo creature for the locals to gawk at. More than once he felt awkward and irritated by the patronizing manner in which others spoke to him. Some even raised their voices and spoke slowly, as if he were some kind of disabled person who did not understand English. More than once he had to restrain himself from punching someone in the face. He remembered a conversation he had with Marion after a recent event. "Are you okay, honey?" she asked when he took off his expensive suit. "No, it's not like that," he growled in his deep baritone. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Did someone say something bad to you?" "Everything is as it was said," he told her. "Do you remember that scene in Outlaw Josie Wales where the character played by Chief Dan George talked about meeting Abraham Lincoln in the White House?" She nodded her head. "Yes, I remember," she said. "They just watched the movie on DVD a couple of evenings ago." "I can understand what he said," he told her. "It's almost as if these people think that because I'm a Pacific Islander, I should have a bone in my nose and wear a loincloth." "Well, you'd need a pretty long one," she told him, patting his crotch. He chuckled at this. "Don't they understand that I graduated from Harvard at the top of my class?" he asked her. "Don't they know how hard I worked to get through college so I wouldn't be a burden and not carry a heavy load of debt?" "I don't think so," she said quietly. "Well, I don't like these people you have to grovel to," he said. "And I'm damn sure I don't like being paraded around like some zoo specimen." "It's all part of the game," she said. "But I understand how you feel. You know you don't have to attend these events if you don't feel comfortable." He shook his head. "No, you are my wife, and I should be there to support you," he said. "Besides, I don't like the idea of someone else accompanying you. By the way, what's up with this new boss of yours, Jake Hamilton?" he asked. That evening he met Jake for the first time and immediately disliked him. Hunter was written all over his face. "They just recently transferred him here," she said. "He's from New York. He's a really nice guy once you get to know him." "He seems to like you," Ram said. He couldn't help but notice that Jake spent most of the evening next to Marion. "Sometimes," he thought, "maybe just too close." "You're not jealous, are you?" she asked. He smiled and pulled her into his big hug. "Of course I'm jealous," he said playfully. "But he knows that you are married, right?" "Yes, He knows, she said, hugging his neck. Okay, said Ram. I hope he remembers. They ended the night making love, but he had a bad feeling in his stomach. Something told him he needed to keep an eye on Jake Hamilton. Over the next 6 months, everything went wrong. Marion ended up being sent out of town with Jake several times and started working much later in the evenings, much more often than before. As a result, their sex life virtually disappeared, as she always seemed too tired to do anything. It all came crashing down one day when Ram was in his office looking through student papers. He was interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," he said. The door opened, and a petite brunette poked her head inside. She adjusted her glasses on her nose before speaking. "Dr. Kiluahin, do you have a couple of minutes?" she asked. He looked at her and immediately recognized her as one of the girls who worked in Marion's office, but he couldn't remember her name. He motioned for her to come inside. "Please come in," he said. "And feel free to call me Ram. My students call me Dr. Kaluahin, but you are obviously not one of my students." She entered his office and stopped in front of his desk. "What can I do for you, Miss?" "Harper," she said quietly. "April." "Harper, I work in your wife's office." "Yes, of course," he said. "What can I do for you, Miss Harper?" "Well," she began nervously, "I don't quite know how to say this." "I think it's best to just say what's on your mind," he told her. She nodded her head. "Well, it's about your wife and Mr. Hamilton," she said, completely capturing his attention. "I'm a little embarrassed to say this because it's quite personal, but I think what they're doing is just wrong, and I thought you had a right to know. That is, unless you already know and approve of it. I know some guys like that kind of stuff." "What is this thing, Miss Harper?" he asked. "What are they doing that upsets you so much?" "They are, well, having an affair," she said. He felt himself blushing. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Miss Harper?" he asked. "This is a serious accusation." "They go out for lunch almost every day," she said, "and their lunches often last longer than usual. They travel together all the time. He buys her flowers, and the way they interact makes it very clear that this is more than just a professional relationship. Plus, all the girls talk. Mr. Hamilton has a bad reputation, although he tries to keep it all a secret." "I understand," Ram said. "Have you personally witnessed anything that would suggest that they were having an affair? Have you seen them kissing each other or doing anything inappropriate? Anything?" "I actually saw them kissing once when they left his office," she said nervously. He nodded his head when she finished. "Tell me, Miss Harper, how often does Mr. Hamilton force you girls to work after hours?" he asked. She shook her head. "Usually we don't work after hours," she said. "The college is very strict about this. Marion and Jake sometimes stay out late, but the rest of us usually don't. The only time we can work after hours is when we are preparing for graduation or matriculation. But even then we have time to catch up. They hate paying overtime." "Understand. Did you say anything to anyone else?" he asked. "I didn't tell anyone anything," she said. "I wanted to convey this to you first. We all like Marion and don't want her to get in trouble. And yet, it is unsettling. If the dean or president ever saw this, they would pay big." "Yes, that would be so," said Ram. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Miss Harper. I'll take care of that next." "Thank you, Dr. Ram," she said. After she left the office, he opened the Word document he had saved on his computer. It was a list of private investigators and divorce lawyers that he had been collecting for some time. He had hoped that he wouldn't need to use any of the information, but he felt like he had no choice now. If she cheated like April said, he would have no choice but to divorce her. He took his phone and called. He wasn't surprised when Marion texted him later that day saying she'd be working late. He sat at the dinner table and picked at his plate, wondering what his wife and Jake were doing at that moment. Finally, he threw the rest of the lasagna down the garbage disposal and went upstairs to the master bedroom. He put on his pajamas and went to bed with the TV on. He woke up when he heard that Marion was in the room. She walked up to him and kissed his forehead. Her hair smelled like it had just been shampooed, and he thought he smelled the scent of aftershave. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I didn't know he would keep me for so long." "I had a snack on the way home." She went to the bathroom and soon came out in flannel pajamas. This was her signal that there would be no sex tonight. He really didn't want to have sex with her anyway, especially if she had just been with Jake. "He often keeps you late," Ram said. "How long will this continue?" "It's hard to say," she said. Because of him, the entire department worked late. He felt furious when he heard that she was lying to him, but he controlled himself. "The whole department, right?" he asked. "I thought the college didn't approve of overtime." "Usually, yes," she said. "But he has a big meeting coming up soon with several big sponsors, and we have to be ready for that." "Oh, that reminds me. We're going to New York on Friday. We leave before lunch and go away for the weekend." "That's pretty short notice," he said. Today was Wednesday, or rather early Thursday morning. "That's why we work so hard now," she said. "I'm sorry, I will make amends to you." "Okay," he said, turning over on his side. He knew it was bullshit, but he wanted to give her enough rope to hang herself. Later that day, Jake came to visit Ram in his office. He knocked on the door and entered before Ram could answer. Ram looked up and saw Jake's eternal grin. "What can I do for you, Mr. Hamilton?" he asked. "I just wanted to pop in and apologize for taking up your wife's time," he said. "I'm sure you may have heard the rumors, and I just wanted to reassure you that nothing untoward is going on." "I don't attach much importance to rumors, Mr. Hamilton," said Ram. "I deal with facts and evidence, and I certainly hope, for your own sake, that nothing inappropriate happens." Jake's grin faltered for a moment. This was not the answer he expected. In his experience, academic types tended to be weaklings. But there was something about this man that made Jake nervous. Maybe it was his voice or the inscrutable way Ram looked at him. There was nothing about Ram that suggested he was a weakling, and for a moment Jake considered abandoning his plans for Marion. "Of course not, Dr. Kaluachane," he said. "By the way, Marion told you that we will be in New York this weekend?" "She did it," Ram said. He deliberately didn't give Jake permission to call him by his first name because he really didn't like the man. "Quite a short notice, I must say. I was planning to take her out on Friday night. Lately, she has been spending more time with you than with me." "I apologize again for that," Jake said. "This is our job. It never ends, you know." "When do you think I can spend some time with my wife?" Ram asked with some sarcasm. "Very soon," Jake said. "We just have some things to take care of. Listen, I have to go now. It was nice talking to you." Ram said nothing, watching as Jake slipped out of the office. After Jake left, he picked up his phone and made another call. That afternoon, he received a text from his wife that she had to stay late at work again to prepare for a meeting that weekend. He wasn't surprised, and the email he received in his personal account didn't surprise him either. He headed home, stopping for dinner along the way. He'd had enough of lies and scraps. Around 8:00 p.m., he called Marion at her work number, but the call went to voicemail. He left a message and dialed Jake's work number. He received the same response, but did not leave a message. He read and reread the message he received earlier that day, and looked at the attached photos. He was still sitting at his computer when Marion returned late that evening. "Are not you asleep yet?" she asked with a concerned expression on her face. "Have you eaten anything?" "I stopped for dinner on the way home," he said. "I'm tired of leftovers." "I'm sorry," she said. "We were going to discuss everything one last time before the meeting." "So you were in your office?" he asked. "Well, yes," she said. "Where else should I be?" "Tell me that," he said. "I called your office at 8 Awai, but did not receive an answer. I also called Jake at the office." "We were in the conference room and didn't hear the phone ring," she said. He knew the layout of her office and knew it was complete nonsense. Even if that was the case, she should have seen a message indicator indicating that someone was calling. "Didn't you see that I left a message?" he asked. "I didn't even look, Rami." "I'm really sorry," she said. "By the way, Jake said you were a little rude to him this morning." And what's all this talk about a date on a Friday night? You never said anything to me about this. It was supposed to be a surprise, he said. I guess it doesn't matter now. Of course it's important, Ram, she said. No, that's not true, he said. Now I need to go to bed, Marion. Good night. He trudged up the stairs to the master bedroom, wondering how long the deception would last before he put an end to it. He said nothing as she slid under the covers and tried to cuddle up to him. I love you, Ram, she whispered in his ear. He chuckled in response. I love you too, Marion, he said quietly, with a hint of sadness in his voice. Good night. She took the hint and rolled away from him. He heard quiet sobs from her side of the bed, but pushed them out of his mind. The next morning, he cornered her before leaving. Can you at least let me know where you're staying and keep in touch with me over the weekend? He asked. Of course, she said. She wrote down her hotel name and room number, then handed him the paper. Thank you, he said, folding the piece of paper and putting it in his pocket. Bon voyage. He turned to go out the door, but Marion intercepted him. Ram, what's the matter? She asked. You haven't been like yourself lately. Did I do something to make you angry at me? He almost laughed out loud. I think you know the answer to this question, he told her. Her face paled as he headed for the door without kissing her goodbye. I love you, Ram, she said, as he got into his car. That's what you said, he replied before starting the car and driving to work. Even though the damage had been done, he hoped that she would realize the error of her ways and change her mind about going to New York. He already knew from the investigator's report that the meeting was a farce set up by Jake to leave them alone for the weekend. Unfortunately, however, she and Jake left for the airport during lunch, and he didn't hear anything from her until she arrived at the hotel. He didn't hear from her for the rest of the weekend, but he heard from an investigator who kept him up to date on what the two lovers were up to. From the reports he had read, they had a lot of fun, visiting local nightclubs, dancing and drinking, and then spending most of the weekend having sex. He almost punched the wall when he saw the video of the two of them in bed. He couldn't help but notice that Jake wasn't using any protection at all. He didn't know if Marion was still on birth control. He considered his options. In his opinion, divorce was not difficult, but he also knew from conversations with colleagues that divorce in the States almost always ended badly for husbands. Then he brainstormed and made a couple of calls abroad that Sunday. He was already in bed when Marion returned home late on Sunday evening. Normally, he would greet her home from trips like this with hugs and kisses and then some romp in bed. But not at this time. He didn't even offer to help carry her bags inside. She put her bags in the closet, changed in the bathroom, and went to bed. She tried to kiss him, but he rolled over so as not to touch her. The next morning, he got up before her and left the house without saying a word to her. During a break, he contacted his investigator and received a full report of Marion's activities over the weekend, then made another call. Marion tried to contact him throughout the day, but he ignored her calls and texts. He saw her at home that evening, but said almost nothing to her. She finally cornered him in the living room after dinner. Ram, what's going on? She asked. You haven't said 2 words to me since I returned home. Don't you want to know if we were successful? He looked at her intently before speaking. I'm sure you got what you wanted, he said. What do you mean by this? She asked. He reached over to his laptop and brought up a video of her in bed with Jake. Her eyes widened as he played the video. Am I better than the savage you married? Jake asked. Please, you know I don't like it when you talk about him like that, she said. He may be a savage, but he is a good man. Well, why are you here with me and not with him? He asked her. You know why, Jake, she said. Yes, I know, he said, hugging her. Let's try again. Disgusted, Ram turned off the video and stared at Marion. How did you do it? She asked Ram when he stopped the video. What's the difference? He asked. What I would like to know is why. Ram, it was just sex, that's all, she said. It had nothing to do with you. You know I would never hurt you. Well, you did it, he said. So tell me, dear wife. I noticed that he did not bother to protect himself. Were you planning on getting pregnant with his child and trying to pass him off as my child? I never thought about it, she said. Weren't you worried about what diseases you might get from him? Ram asked. According to my report, Jake has at least 2 other women with whom he regularly dates, and that's not counting his frequent one-night stands. He assured me that he was clean, Marion said. And of course, you foolishly believed him, said Ram. After you disrespected me, I can no longer work here. I requested a transfer home. I have already spoken to the Chancellor, and he agrees that it will be better this way. He also agreed to fire both you and JK for flagrant violations of university rules. When do you plan to leave? She asked. At the end of the semester, which ends this week, he said. We're leaving on Friday. What about us? She asked. There's no more us, he told her. You killed it. The divorce will be finalized when we return. Both you and Jake will need to be present. I don't care what you do next. Why does Jake need to be there? She asked. Why do you think? He asked in response. He's the one you cheated on me with. The order has already been given. He can either leave peacefully on his own or be extradited. Extradited? She asked. Isn't this too extreme? You're forgetting that the Katani people have an extradition treaty with the United States, he said. When you married me, you received dual citizenship. As for Jake, he has no choice. He will be there, one way or another. Ram stood up, indicating that he was finished and would not say anything more. Marion sat there, stunned by what had just happened. Jake assured her that Ram would never find out, but he did. Please, Ram, I don't want a divorce, she said with tears in her eyes. He stared at her for a few seconds before leaving the room. Why did you do that? He asked. Wasn't I good enough for you? You are the best, she said. Then tell me why, he demanded. Well, Jake and I knew each other in college, she said. He was my first, and I think I just fell in love with him again. I think the old saying is true, he told her. What kind of saying is this? She asked in confusion. This is an interpretation of your Bible passage that says there is a season for everything, he said. Time to deceive and time to die. What do you mean? She asked. Are you saying that we have no hope? When you cheated on me, you ruined our marriage, he said. You killed us. I hope it was worth it for you. The rest of the week was difficult. The rector called Jake and Marion into his office and fired them both for violating university rules regarding adultery. He then handed Jake a piece of paper that had been emailed to him the day before. What the hell is this? Jake asked angrily. A call from the Kingdom of Katani, said the Chancellor. You are involved in Dr. Kaluachane's divorce. I was told that if you refuse to go, you will face extradition. The plane ticket is sent by express mail. Security will meet you there. This is bullshit, Jake exclaimed. Perhaps, said the Chancellor. But the State Department told me that all this is legal. They stay away from it. Now pick up your trash and get out of my school. You both. Dejected and ashamed, Marion went to her desk and collected her things. Jake, however, had another idea and headed to Ram's office. Ram was checking documents when an angry Jake burst into his office. Ram put down his grading pen before looking at Jake. You fucking son of a bitch! Jake shouted, rushing across the office, determined to put the big guy on the floor. Ram simply reached out and grabbed Jake by the throat, abruptly stopping his reckless attack. He stood over Jake, who lay on the floor, gasping for air and shaking his head. Get out of my office, he said calmly, and I don't want to see you until the hearing. The rest of the week went by pretty quickly. Ram avoided Marion as much as he could and said virtually nothing to her. Marion tried to win back her husband's affections, but he mostly ignored her and simply walked away when she started crying. On Wednesday, movers arrived at the house, collected their belongings, and prepared them for shipment to Katani. The realtor has already put up a for sale sign in the yard. After clearing everything out of the house and getting all their affairs in order, Ram and Marion spent the night at the motel, sleeping in separate beds. It was difficult as he had always found her sexy and very seductive, but he was determined not to give in to her. They took off early on Friday morning. After they settled into their room at the Marriott, he made a couple of calls and learned that Jake had indeed left the States and was heading to the island. He then learned that the trial would take place on Monday, and Jake was taken into custody by the Royal Guard, an elite unit of the National Police. It had been a rough weekend for both of them. Marion did everything she could to talk him out of it, but he rejected her efforts. "Please, can't we get through this?" she begged. He looked at her and simply shook his head. "No," he growled. "You disrespected me in the worst way a woman can. You have made your choice. Now you have to live with it." "But I promise it will never happen again," she whined. "Please, Ram, I love you." "And I loved you too," he said. "And in general, what is the use of your promises? Do you remember the promise you made to me when we got married? You couldn't keep that promise, so how can I trust you to keep any other promises?" "We can try to see a psychologist, right?" she asked. "Please, Ram, I beg you. It didn't mean anything. I didn't mean to hurt you." "Shut up, woman," he thundered. "It meant everything to me, damn it. You swore to me and only to me, just as I swore only to you. I kept my promise to you, but you broke yours to me. Now it's time to deal with this and move on." Finally, Monday morning came, and Ram woke Marion up at 4:30 a.m. "Why are you waking me up so early?" she asked. "It's time to get ready," he said. "You should probably have some breakfast before we leave. We have a long trip ahead of us." "But the courthouse is not that far," she said. "It's just a few blocks from here. We can walk there in less than half an hour." "We're not going to the courthouse," he said. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Mount Sitani," he said, referring to the dormant volcano at the southernmost tip of the island. The last time it erupted more than 2,500 years ago, it blew away the top third of the mountain, leaving a giant hole in the ground that later became a sacred site for the island's population. "You were the only one who wanted a traditional marriage. I think it's entirely appropriate for us to have a traditional divorce." The realization of what he said began to dawn on her. "What?" she asked. "You can't mean—" "Yes," he said. "Now get ready. We have plenty of time to eat before heading out." Shocked, Marion got up and went to the bathroom to get ready. She knew the legends of Mount Stani and the place it held in local folklore. This was the traditional place where marriages were dissolved, but these ceremonies usually ended in someone's death. Of course he wouldn't do that, she thought. After they got dressed, Raman put the gym bag in the trunk of their rental car and led her to the dining room where they had breakfast. He had a hearty breakfast, as always, but she barely touched the food. Inside, she was a bundle of nerves. Of course, the old stories were just that. Stories, she told herself. Or was it true? The drive to the mountain, located at the southernmost tip of the island, would take more than an hour. She sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window and feeling like a convicted criminal being led to the gallows. Finally, they reached their destination. Ram pulled off the winding two-lane highway and pulled into a parking lot where he stopped the car. He went out, grabbed his bag, and opened Marion's door. "Let's go," he said quietly. Marion looked at him with tears in her eyes and slowly got out of the car. Her legs buckled as she stood, but he supported her and led her to the ancient stone steps that led to the top of Mount Sitani. "Go up the steps," he told her. Trembling, she began the long climb up the stairs, wondering how many other people had done this in ancient times. When they reached the top, they were greeted by two uniformed members of the Royal Guard. Looking closer, they saw several elderly Katani sitting in a semicircle in front of an ancient stone tablet that jutted out over the giant gaping hole that had once been the caldera of Mount Sitani. She knew that the hole was at least 1.5 kilometers deep, and at the bottom there was a stream of lava. They also noticed a portable gazebo surrounded by royal guards. Large flags fluttered on both sides of the gazebo. Inside the enclosure was an elderly Katani dressed in traditional clothing. Marion gasped when she realized who it was. She looked at Ram. "Do you know the king?" she asked. I have to, he said. He is my father's brother. Ram looked at the guards. Get her ready, he told them. He watched as they took her to a tent and went to another where he put on his traditional attire. He looked at his sivaj and remembered the day on the beach when Marion gave it to him. He tucked it into his belt and went outside again. By that time, Marion was ready, and she was led to the board in a short, red robe. Jake had already been delivered, and he stood on the board, tightly bound hand and foot. He was not too pleased, but the guards had already warned him to remain silent until he was addressed. Ram approached the gazebo and bowed to his uncle, who greeted him with a nod of his head. He then took his place before the tribunal, which was arranged in a semicircle in front of the board. Prince Raman Kaluachain, said the man in the center of the semicircle. This court has considered your petition for divorce. We have also reviewed all the evidence and have concluded that your case is valid. Based on the evidence, your petition for divorce has been granted. Do you want to address those who have wronged you before you make a final judgment? I'll ask, counselor, said Ram. Very good then, said the older man. Continue. Raman bowed to the tribunal and turned to face Marion and Jake, who were now tied to each other on the board. He could tell that Marion was scared, which she had every right to be. Jake, on the other hand, had no idea what was about to happen and remained arrogant as always. What the hell does this all mean? Jake asked as Ram approached them. Shut up, Marion told Jake. Why? Jake asked. Are they going to sacrifice us to their volcano god or something? God, you're such an ass, she whispered. Are you two done? Ram asked. They said nothing, staring back at him. Ram continued, looking at his soon-to-be ex-wife. Do you remember the promise you made to me there on the beach 5 years ago? He asked. I remember, she said. Did you fully understand the nature of the promise we made to each other? He asked. Yes, I understand, she said slowly. Ram nodded his head sadly. He gave her a way out, but she didn't take advantage of it. It would be one thing if she didn't understand the nature of her wedding vows. However, her confession to the contrary sealed her fate. Promise? Jake asked. What promise? Marion wanted a traditional Kaatani marriage, part of which requires the couple to commit their mind, body, and soul to each other for the rest of their lives. He explained. You see, Jake, we believe that the most important trait a person can have is loyalty. Without it, nothing else matters. In the old days, when a Kaatani couple married, they swore an oath to each other in front of witnesses, fully understanding that the price of betrayal would be their very lives. He pulled out a sharp, curved knife from his belt. Jake's eyes widened when he saw the blade. But this is murder, Jake muttered. In your culture, perhaps, said Ram. Here we call it a divorce. This blade was given to me by Marion on our wedding day, as tradition requires. It's more than just a trinket to hide behind glass. In the time of my ancestors, it was worn by the husband as a sign that he was unavailable. It was also intended as a warning to anyone who might harass the married couple. Someone like you, Jake. With these words, Ram waved his hand in the blink of an eye. When he finished, a red line appeared on Jake's neck and his eyes widened as he realized that his carotid artery had just been severed. Blood gushed from his neck, and he began to sway, losing strength. Marion tried to hold them on the stone board, but it was difficult since Jake did not have the strength to stand. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind blew over them, causing Marion and Jake to fall into the abyss below. Ram closed his eyes for a moment, trying to stop himself from sobbing. He opened his eyes and threw the blade into the large hole, then took off his wedding ring and threw it after the knife. He heard the sound of a gavel behind him, and the chairman of the tribunal spoke. This divorce is final, he said. Ram stared straight ahead as the tribunal members gathered their things and left. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned around to see his uncle standing next to him. You loved her, his uncle said. So it was, said Ram. You even gave her a way out, but she didn't use it, said the elderly man. In the end, she acted nobly. I suppose so, said Ram. "I know it was the hardest thing you have ever had to do, my son," said the king. "Believe me, when you find yourself in my position, it won't get any easier." "You will outlive me, uncle," said Ram. The older man chuckled. "Hardly," he said. "In any case, your honor is restored. Now it's time to mourn what was lost and move forward. By the way, Sika is looking forward to your call. She still loves you and has managed to keep the hounds at bay." "After so many years?" Raman asked. "Yes," said the king. He pulled out a card and handed it to Raman. "She would be a good wife and a good queen for you when the time comes. And I must admit, I always wanted a real doctor in the family." The last time Raman spoke to her, she was in the States working on her medical degree and residency. "Now please call the girl and give her your number, and let her know that I'm not your answering machine," the king said with a smile. Raman laughed at this. "Thank you, uncle," he said. "I will do it." The older man smiled and patted him on the shoulder before leaving. Raman went to his tent and changed into the clothes he was wearing before. He sat for a minute and thought about Marion. He wiped the tears from his eyes and walked down the steps to his car. Once he got into the car, he took out his phone and saw that he had good service. He dialed the number his uncle gave him. "Cha," said a pleasant female voice after the first ring. He remembered his younger years and the sweet, seductive, dark-haired woman who had attracted him so much before he met Marion. "Cha," he said in response. "Divorce is final." "Okay," she said. "Now please go home to the one who loved you first, Ram. I missed you so much." "I'm on my way," he said. Perhaps there really is something special in first love, he thought. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.